Okay, so today I just want to give you kind of an overview of some of the things that we've been doing at the University of Michigan and some other institutions that we collaborate with, and a few other spots around the world that are interested in particular topics related to therapeutic, ultrasound, and particularly those that are related to gas bubbles and acoustic cavitation. So first of all and foremost, I want to thank Thunder for their support and having me come over to the UK and tour around the country and visit several labs to provide some feedback and interactions between the groups, and hopefully we'll generate some future collaborations together. So my thanks to Gail Terhar and the management committee, along with the steering committee and the members of Thunder for supporting my trip here. So anytime that I give a talk, whether it's in the US or anywhere else around the world, I have to give my financial disclosures. For the purposes of this discussion today, the primary one is Histotripsy. Histotripsy is a startup company that's commercializing one of the topics that I'll talk about later, which is Histotripsy. So I have to provide that disclosure to you. So I don't do this stuff in a vacuum, obviously. It takes a team of people, just like the team that's in this room, to do this kind of research. And for the topic of acoustic droplet vaporization, ADV, then it's obviously a team effort. And my great appreciation to particularly the postdoc students that have worked in the lab over time. So what is acoustic droplet vaporization? Basically, if you take an ultrasound field at low amplitude and expose a sonosensitive emulsion, a droplet of liquid to that pulse, nothing will happen. But once you cross a critical threshold for that ultrasound amplitude, you can actually trigger a liquid droplet to form a gas bubble. And so here you see a solid or a perfluorocarbon liquid, only the perfluorocarbon in a droplet, then exposed to an ultrasound pulse and triggered to form a gas bubble. In this picture over here, we've replaced 95+% of the perfluorocarbon with tiny particles in a drug delivery scheme that I'll talk about, where we can still trigger the perfluorocarbon that's on the inside of the droplet then to release the drug. Now these are high-speed images done on the Brandaris camera at Erasmus, and it allows us then to see the very early stages at about 12 million frames per second to see this vaporization process. And so that then allowed us, on a camera that we have in our lab that will go a bit faster than that, to see a set of frames at the very beginning of this vaporization process. Now I'm a physicist, and the nice thing about this is this intersection between the physical phenomenon that's of interest and then being able to apply it in the medical circumstance. So this is fun for me because we can actually see the cavitation process being initiated on the inside of the droplet, and initially at one spot and then at a second spot, and eventually all of the perfluorocarbon liquid gets converted into a gas and forms the gas bubble. Now the interesting thing here, the ultrasound is propagating along this direction, and if you model the actual ultrasound field in and around this droplet, in and within this droplet, then you can actually show that there is a focusing effect for the sound field within the droplet whose location depends on the size of the droplet. And so you can actually predict that this ultrasound field will trigger the droplet at a particular location. So this is actually focusing the field within the droplet in order to increase the pressure amplitude on the inside of the droplet to then trigger the vaporization process.
What's the scale bar on those figures?
This is 10 micron, I believe, is the scale bar for it. And so these droplets that are relatively small, the focusing occurs near the front. The larger droplets focus near the back. And it's actually a lensing effect. So the speed of sound for the perfluorocarbon differs from the surrounding liquid, from the surrounding water. And there you get this focusing effect on the inside. But, Robin, to your point, the wavelength here is actually pretty long in comparison to the droplet size. And so it's actually only the higher harmonics that actually can be focused within the field, because it's only those higher frequency components where you actually can get that focusing effect. So you actually do need a bit of a shock wave to get focusing for the very smallest of droplets. Yeah. Otherwise it'd be defeating, right? It wouldn't be acoustics at that point, right? So how do you use these droplets? What are you going to use them for? So we're obviously using them to trigger to form gas bubbles. Those gas bubbles then will increase the local heating and allow you to heat the tissue faster and a larger volume as a consequence of that. So if we look at an MR image of a canine liver where we've triggered droplets and then done thermal therapies, we actually get lesions on the inside of the liver that are about 15 times larger in volume compared to the case where there were no droplets. So that gives us an ability to amplify HIFU treatment, high intensity focused ultrasound, where one of the limitations is how rapidly you can treat a substantial volume. The problem is that when you're going through the tissue down to your focus, the focus is relatively small compared to your aperture size. So that when you slide the aperture over to make the next spot, most of your sound is going through the same path. So then you have to slow down because you're now getting heating in that overlying path. So if you can actually produce a larger lesion, you can spread the lesions apart, you can go through this process faster, and be able to accelerate the rate at which you can do a HIFU treatment in a substantial volume. So does it work in a tumor? Well, it does. Here's a picture of a tumor before treatment. This is the tumor in the mouse model with one shot of therapeutic ultrasound. This is work that was done in conjunction with Shanghai Jiao Tong University on a commercial system from China. And then you can see the result where we treated the entire tumor with one shot. Obviously, we could have used 2 shots and achieved the same thing, but the idea here is that we actually can treat a larger volume with the same amount of ultrasound intensity and get the corresponding effect. So as you might guess, we actually see then the one that we treated completely, then it actually shrinks over time, and the one that we treated only partially, we slowed its growth, but then the growth begins to recover, and then this is the control case. So we can actually get a change in the amount of treatment effect we get in these tumors for the same amount of ultrasound being applied. The other thing that's interesting about this, when you think about the size droplets, these droplets are injectable droplets that are basically less than 6 microns in size. They're nominally the size of a red blood cell. So once you trigger them, they're going to be about 5 to 6 times larger in diameter as a consequence of the phase conversion, which means that now you've created a bubble that's fairly sizable compared to the blood vessels around. So if you look in the cremaster muscle, where you can actually visualize the vasculature within the muscle and look for the triggering of these droplets, you can actually see the consequence of that process, where you see bubbles being produced within the region, and now you can see these bubbles are actually lodged within the vasculature. You can see vasculature, blood flow in the vasculature slowing down as a consequence of the blockage that occurred. So what does this mean? Once you start to make that block, then now you no longer have the tissue perfusion that normally would be carrying away the heating. In addition, you can have just the straight up effect of the blockage of blood flow to the tumor. And the interesting thing was when Joe Bull, a colleague of mine, started looking at the biofluid mechanics of these bubbles, he actually could predict nominally the shape of these bubbles, and more importantly, he could predict what the aspect ratio should be for a single bubble that was formed in a larger vessel and then gradually goes down the vascular chain until it gets lodged in a small vessel. And it turns out that we looked back at the size of the bubbles that were lodging individually, and those bubbles then had an aspect ratio of the bubble length to hydrodynamic diameter of about a factor of 2, and the theory says they should stick at about a factor of 2. So this was a very nice way of, here's the biofluid mechanics being able to reflect exactly where you would expect the lodging to occur. And then you get the experimental result that goes with it. So Joe then, who's now at Tulane University, has done some work along with us to look at the lodging of large numbers of bubbles in vessels, and to see whether or not you actually can affect the tumor growth rate using that copious amounts of bubbles. And this is only the bubbles, so this is not the thermal effect that's causing the reduction in the growth rate of the tumor in this animal model. So this growth rate here is only due to the constraint of the perfusion that exists within that tumor. The other thing that's interesting about the perfluorocarbons in particular is that they can act as an oxygen scavenger. So Kevin Hayworth and colleagues at the University of Cincinnati started looking at the possibility of actually changing the oxygen content in the blood using the perfluorocarbon agents. So in the experiments that he did, he actually looked at vaporizing the droplets, and then they began to suck up the local oxygen in the flow. And he looked at this experimentally then, triggering the droplets in flow, and then looking at two oxygen sensors downstream, and he could actually show that you reduce the oxygen content downstream once you trigger these droplets. So now it's sucking oxygen from the surrounding medium at the same time that it's slowing the blood flow down so it can't replenish its oxygen. So now you're getting a double hit for the process. Now I know that Eleanor Stride here at Oxford has actually looked at kind of flipping this on its ear, which is you can load up the droplets with oxygen and be able to deliver oxygen. And that makes perfect sense, because these types of perfluorocarbons, or ones like them, have actually been used as blood substitutes for patients that couldn't receive a normal transfusion. So you can use them as oxygen carriers. And the nice thing is, for droplets that are like this, you can actually then trigger the release and deposit on demand of that oxygen. So again, in conjunction with colleagues at Shanghai Jiao Tong, we wanted to look at then this process of actually triggering the droplets to form the gas bubbles, and how would that shape and form this cloud of bubbles, and what would the effect of those bubbles be on the thermal therapy. So we wanted to see if we could get to the point where we could actually model what's going to happen in a system. So we took nominally a transducer, one model like we have in the lab, a region that would contain droplets. We're going to focus the ultrasound through the simulation at a particular site, and then we're going to look at the triggering of the droplets, and also ultimately the thermal lesion that's produced. So first we have to look at the bubble cloud. So how does this bubble cloud evolve? So if you look here, this is what the ultrasound field looks like when you fire the first pulse. So there are no bubbles, there are only the droplets. We haven't triggered any of the droplets to form gas bubbles yet. So on the first pulse, this waveform or focal zone looks very much like what you would expect, a nice rice grain shaped type focal zone with high amplitude in the center. Well, if you threshold this for what it takes then to trigger the droplets to form gas bubbles, you would expect a zone of gas bubbles that would look something like this. When you send the next pulse, you now have this collection of bubbles. So if you model then what the field is going to look like in response to the presence of those bubbles, you actually see that the acoustic field looks more like this now, where the only spot that's relatively high in amplitude is very near the front. And so as the pulses continue, the third, the fifth, the seventh, and on, you get a particular shape to this lesion that's controlled by the shadow cast by that set of gas bubbles that you produced. And so when the modeling started, they started this process of looking at the shape of this, and then we compared it to some results that were made several years before by one of the students in our lab, and actually the shape looked very much like what you would predict. And the shapes can be very complicated. So if you go up in amplitude and fire numerous shots, maybe 200 shots in, then you can actually get triangular shaped clouds of gas bubbles. And once the density gets high here, you actually have enough being reflected off the front of this bubble interface to actually trigger droplets in front. Now, this is really cool, because what this tells you is if I don't want ultrasound back here, all I have to do is generate a dense bubble cloud this way, and I can actually protect tissues that are downstream from the ultrasound, and actually be able to protect sensitive tissues by triggering a bubble cloud in front of those tissues in order to stop the sound propagation. So these can be very unique and complicated bubble clouds. This is one that kind of looks like an arrowhead, right? And the prediction indeed looks very much like the arrowhead. So this is 200 pulses in a phantom that has droplets in it, but in addition to having droplets, it also has albumin. And so the albumin can be triggered to cross-link as it would a tissue if you were cooking it, right? So you can now apply the thermal therapy and see what happens to the thermal therapy when a bubble cloud like this is present. And so what you see is a thermal lesion that's formed. This is the cross-linking of the albumin, but you don't see any lesion back here, right? Because the sound can't get there. Normally you would expect this lesion to be oriented this way, actually, because the sound is coming from this direction. You'd expect a nice rice grain shape of a lesion right here. But instead it's turned at 90 degrees. So now you can shape the lesions in different ways by putting the bubble cloud in front and be able to control then the sound propagation from that point forward. So this is a bubble cloud. This is a thermal lesion that's produced in front of the bubble cloud. How do we know? Well, if you take the sample and you compress it, then you can drive the gas bubbles back into solution, and it leaves you only with the thermal lesion. So now we know that this portion right here is actually the thermal lesion that was produced. And so, depending on the bubble cloud that you produce, these are ultrasound images of the bubble cloud, and then this is the prediction of the shape of said bubble cloud. You can actually start to look at what the thermal lesions would look like as a consequence, and these are actually bioheat modeling of what the thermal lesion should look like. This is with SJTU. It's actually their bioheat lab that's working on this problem. So, how do you kind of up the ante on this? Well, one way to do that is to use a system that's designed for MR-guided HIFU and think about what kinds of shapes of clouds you can actually use to control how large a volume you can treat at one time. And so remember I said that you can't get the ultrasound past. So imagine for a moment that the ultrasound is coming through this way. It comes to this tabletop here and it can't get through. Well, what would happen if we built walls like this that were sitting on top of the tabletop? And then we fired our ultrasound in between the walls in order to treat the tissue that's in this volume. So now we've created a trap, an acoustic trap, and that acoustic trap then will actually control where the thermal therapy will occur. So this system, the Sonaleaf system, will actually allow you to steer, and one of the ways it likes to steer and in the treatment process is actually in a spiral. Okay? So what we did was we built a wall by using the HIFU beam, just pulse at low amplitude to trigger the droplets. So we build the back wall, and then we spiraled the beam around like this, and that created then this channel. And then we started putting thermal lesions in the channel with the expectation that we could treat this entire thing. So, if we don't have the trench to trap the sound, and we just apply this set of lesions, then we only treat where the lesions are produced. But by trapping the sound in here, we can actually then vaporize and treat within this entire volume in a shorter period of time. So the lesion volume that we can produce is substantially larger than it would have been had we not had the bubble trench to be able to trap the sound. And not only are we trapping the sound to do the treatment, but we also know, because we built the wall in the back, we can't get sound past that point. So it then controls where it is we're treating and what volume we're actually treating. So the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is potential for drug delivery in the context of droplets. So you can make these droplets as double emulsions in a lot of different ways. So here, in a one-step process of an emulsion, you can actually have the perfluorocarbon liquid on the inside and a drug surrogate on the outside, and then the whole thing encapsulated. You can do a two-step process. This is oil and water. This is oil and water where we put the oil droplet on the inside of the perfluorocarbon droplet. And then the picture that I showed you at the very beginning was a double emulsion where it's water-based particles that are on the inside of an overall droplet. Okay? So, excuse me, I can encapsulate oil-based drugs or aqueous-based drugs, both of which inside the context of one of these droplets. So Mario Fabili is interested in this problem. This is what the perfluorocarbon looks like in oil. So when you trigger it with the high-speed camera on, you can see the vaporization, and it kind of squeezes the oil out. And then this is the picture that I showed you the first time, which is triggering the droplet then with the perfluorocarbon on the surrounding the smaller particles, and you can see the growth. So Mario Fabili, who's one of our faculty members, is interested in creating what he calls the acoustically responsive scaffold. So this is for a biomedical or tissue engineering process. So what we want to do is we want to have spatial and temporal control over the release of these agents. And his first target for this is actually limb ischemia. So if you end up with blockage, blood vessel blockage in the leg, then you can go in and try to revise that vessel, but there's quite a bit of a recurrence rate for the blockage to come back. You could also inject a construct, a tissue engineered construct around it, and initiate angiogenesis and create collateral flow that will actually bypass the blockage. So the idea is you start out with an agent that's encapsulated, an angiogenic agent that's encapsulated inside of a fibrin gel. When you hit it with ultrasound, it forms gas bubbles and releases the growth agent into the medium, and then that triggers angiogenesis then to restore the collateral flow, or to create the collateral flow. So in the past, we had been making these emulsions using a shaking process, similar to some of the contrast agents that are on the commercial market. Now we're using a microfluidic chip in order to do the same. So we start out with the emulsion that has the small particles on the inside, and then we combine that with a second phase which has the perfluorocarbon, and then we create the double emulsions. So this is actually perfluorocarbon liquid that has the small particles that are water-based in it, and then we're sending in a phospholipid fluid, a fluid that contains phospholipids, then to form the outer shell for the particles. Then what he does is he can take that material and he can put it in a 5-prenogen hydrogel, and then some of these hydrogels are even injectable. So now you don't have to do a surgical implant. You actually are able to go into that site and inject the material. The nice thing is you have spatial temporal control. So if you create one of these targets, and on the inside you have the perfluorocarbon material, what they did as an initial test is they used beads that were coated with HUVEC cells and fibroblasts out in this region. They released a growth factor that will cause the HUVEC cells to actually form tubules out. So this is a way of being able to demonstrate the release and control that you would have in forming a angiogenic-like process. So if you use no ultrasound, you get no triggering of the droplets. When you trigger it with ultrasound, then obviously you get gas bubbles in here, and that's actually releasing then the drug from the inner portion of this construct. So what does this look like? This is a stain for fibroblasts, and so you can see the fibroblasts are nice and happy out here, even though they've been exposed to the angiogenic agent. They actually, the growth agent actually stimulates the fibroblasts as well. And then the beads here, you can see the tubules that are growing out from the beads. And then we quantify the amount of tubule growth that you have in and around these beads to show that we can actually stimulate this growth. So, if you don't apply the ultrasound, you get no growth, which means that the drug is indeed sequestered, right? And this is after days of time, so you clearly have a stable emulsion that you're then able to trigger and release the drug. If you then release the drug, you can see then that you actually increase the tubule length over time, and you can delay that. You can either treat half or release it from half of the construct on day one, and then the other day sometime later, and then one half at day one, and then the second half even a later time, and then, excuse me, you get the corresponding response for growing of these tubules. The fibroblasts also are very happy to have this additional release of the growth factor. Can you do it in vivo? Obviously, that's one of the tests, right? So we took a growth factor for angiogenesis, did an implant in a mouse model, and in that mouse model then we triggered the release of the growth agent and looked for angiogenesis. So on the top row here, this is just the fibrin that's been injected. The implant with the growth factor in it, the acoustically responsive scaffold that has the growth factor but isn't yet triggered by ultrasound, and the one that's triggered by ultrasound. And you'll notice that the one that generates the most angiogenesis in this LASCA, these are laser-based perfusion measurements, you see that it's the largest growth or the largest amount of signal exists for the case where you triggered it by ultrasound. So it likes the bolus of that release, getting those drugs out quickly and at once. So you can see then, if you look at the percent change in perfusion using this LASCA method, the imaging method that I just showed you, then you can see by day 7, you actually have the largest amount of growth from the ultrasound release within the scaffold. It does recede after that, which is a known problem. If you don't periodically give it a little more juice, then the angiogenesis will decay over time. So you need to be able to do both a spatial and a temporal release of these agents in order to keep the growth going. And then this is a CD31 stain, and that just lets us know that it's a standard stain and it's giving us the same similar information to the LASCA result. The thing you have to worry about with CD37 or CD31 is It will stain for endothelial cells. That doesn't mean that those vessels are active. It only means that they're there. So the LASCA results gives us some confidence that what we've initiated actually is perfusing. So the other thing I want to talk about is histotripsy. So I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to forget about injecting bubbles, and I want you to forget about injecting droplets, and I want you to forget about injecting anything except ultrasound. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to use ultrasound at an intensity level, an acoustic amplitude level, sufficient to be able to produce gas bubbles in situ with just the ultrasound. We don't need anything else. Okay? So this is analogous to shockwave lithotripsy. I'm sure that most of the room knows what shockwave lithotripsy is. Most of the room probably knows what histotripsy is. So histotripsy is that analogy to shockwave lithotripsy, where we're going to treat tissues and crush tissues rather than treating kidney stones. Again, this is a great group of people to work with. I've been working with Jen, Zhu, and Charles Kane, and others that are part of that histotripsy team for many years now. And we've added in Fred Lee and a group from University of Wisconsin to join us in an effort to try and push this forward to the point where we can get it into the clinic. And obviously it's also a part of the histosonics process. So first and foremost, histotripsy is not HIFU, which we have to spend our time, part of our time, reminding people that it's not the same thing. So histotripsy is using very high intensity pulses of ultrasound to do a mechanical effect. And the end effect of the ultrasound is cellular fractionation. So we are going to liquefy the tissue. As opposed to HIFU, it's using high intensity ultrasound in a continuous fashion to produce a thermal effect. And the endpoint is coagulative necrosis, which is a different process. Okay? So what does this look like? This is what makes it fun for the physics, right? You shoot this ultrasound pulse into a water tank and you get this massive bubble cloud because the pressure is really, really large. And this bubble cloud forms and collapses within a few hundreds of microseconds. What is so cool about this is the ultrasound pulse that was used to produce this bubble cloud was 10 microseconds long. So when you think about the inertia that had to put into a system to get the bubble cloud to grow and collapse hundreds of microseconds out in time, it's a pretty amazing physical phenomenon that's going on. And it's a lot of mechanical energy that's happening at this site. So you can see how something like this would be able to disrupt tissues, and it does. So here's a picture of a piece of liver, and if you turn U of M students loose, then this is what you get, right? You get an M that they're steering the ultrasound, moving the ultrasound around in order to carve out this M. So there are two things to notice in this M. One is you see the bright echoes that exist, and these bright echoes are the bubbles that are doing the work, right? But the other thing that you notice, if you look, ignore these bright echoes that are sitting in here, and you see an anechoic region in here of a low echogenicity compared to the normal tissue that's sitting out here. Why? You create a cyst. You have now broken down all of the tissue components at a level that you can't scatter the sound off of anything. And so at that point, it's the equivalent of of a cyst that you would see that's just fluid filled. All right? So this is what it looks like kind of in an in vitro experiment. This is what it looks like in vivo. And I'm going to have to dim the lights here because even though it starts out nice and bright, and you can see this big bright bubble cloud, as soon as I run this video, then not so much, okay? I was told we had to turn it off. And it went exactly the other way. Is it going to go down? There it goes. Okay. So what you see in this image is the bright echoes that are being produced by the bubbles for an ultrasound field that's treating a canine prostate. So this is the entire prostate here. This region over here has already been treated. So it's already anechoic. So this has already been emulsified, and we've moved the focal zone to the next position that we're working on. So in this process, you get this nice feedback. Not only do you see that you've got enough bubble activity to do the work that you want to do, but you also, when you're done, have an anechoic region for a few moments while you're moving to the next spot, so that you know that you've completed the treatment process. Now, you may have over-treated, so you may not have to spend that much time, but at least this is a mechanism by which you can tell that you've done the work. So now, go back up. And then okay. Up. Okay. So, I don't think I have any more videos. So, lithotripsy pulses look like this. Histotripsy pulses look like this. That does not mean that, thank you, that the histotripsy pulse that looks like this can't do lithotripsy as well, which it actually can. And this is the stuff that Adam Maxwell and colleagues at University of Washington are doing burst wave histotripsy, or lithotripsy, where they're using bursts of ultrasound actually to crack and crush stones. So, these lithotripsy pulses are very high amplitude, so they have a large shock wave on the positive side and then a slow negative. These guys are similarly shocked, okay, but it's multiple cycles. So what happens? There are two ways of initiating histotripsy, okay? The work that was done at the University of Michigan has been focused on a high acoustic pressure for a short pulse to trigger the formation of this bubble cloud and work on that bubble cloud. The guys at University of Washington have used lower amplitudes, slightly lower amplitudes, to generate a boiling bubble, and then have been using the effects of the boiling bubble or on the boiling bubble to produce the histotripsy. The difference is pulse length. For the boiling histotripsy, you need 4 to 10 millisecond pulse lengths, whereas with the short pulse histotripsy, you can do that with a few cycles. In fact, you can do it with one cycle. So let's talk about how this works. Again, the physics is the fun, at least for me. You now have pressures that are on the order of 20 megapascals negative and 80 megapascals positive. This is what it looks like when the pulse goes through. So now looking at with a high-speed camera, you can actually see the index of refraction change due to the pulse that's coming through. And so that's the shock wave that's coming through, the striations that you see. Then you see a bubble that forms on the mock cone, the very central portion of the beam, and then the bubble cloud forms. But the bubble cloud's moving backwards, right? Ultrasound's coming from this way, and the bubble cloud is growing this way. So what's the deal? Well, it turns out that the way this is working is actually using shock scattering. This is what we think. So what happens is you do generate this first bubble on axis, but the scattering of the subsequent shock waves that are coming in from the other side are scattering off of that bubble cloud, and then they're interfering with the incoming negative half cycle of the next cycle, and that combination then goes super threshold. And so then with each subsequent wave that's coming in, there's a little bit of a wave that's coming back out, and the two combine, you go super threshold, you generate a bunch of cavitation. So graphically you generate, and again, a little warning, I'm now propagating from the left instead of from the right. The bubble is coming in, the sound wave is coming in, it forms the first gas bubble. You get a reflection off of that gas bubble. We know from impedance of the fluid that if you go from high impedance to low impedance, The boundary condition is a pressure 0. And so in order to do that, I have to take that positive pressure and I have to flip it negative. And so a portion of this shock wave that came through is now flipped back negative. It's then propagating forward and combining with the next half cycle that's coming in, and this then goes super threshold. And as soon as it goes super threshold, then you end up with a huge amount of gas bubbles that are activated. It was actually the Russians, and we were talking about this in Seattle because we had a large Russian contingent there, that actually were the first ones to realize, we think, that there was this, they think, I think they think correctly, that this population of bubbles that exist that are on the 2 to 3 nanometer scale is a copious number of bubbles that exist both in water and tissue. Basically, they're ubiquitous, okay? And so what happens is if you stress a nucleus that's on this size order at about 28 megapascals, this thing will grow rapidly and expand. So what we think happens is that when you flip that pulse around, you go beyond that 28 or so megapascal point, even though you don't have that in the original field, in the propagated field, and that then gives you this big, healthy bubble cloud. So the supposition then would be, well, what if we just took the negative half cycle and pushed it down far enough that we could trigger it with just a single cycle of negative pressure that was that high. So that's what we call intrinsic threshold. So if you go down to something that's really, really low in amplitude, really low negative pressure, then you can trigger it. And you can trigger it in water. So this is the cloud probability as a function of the negative pressure. And so once you go up this curve, you can reach a point where there's 100% probability that when you send that pulse in, you're going to trigger a bubble cloud of this type. And notice it'll happen in water, it'll happen in gelatin, it happens in blood, it happens in kidney. And all of these at about the same level, on the order of about 28, 30 megapascal. The interesting one is the fat. The fat's all the way down here to about 15 megapascal. So that might mean that there's actually a preferential way of stabilizing bubbles within that fat context, or it may be that different processes are happening within the fat that then lower the probability, or increase the probability at low pressure for generating a bubble cloud. So since this thing is so sensitive to the pressure amplitude, right, to this negative pressure, then it's only the portion of the beam that's beyond that pressure amplitude that's actually going to form this cloud. So that gives you very, very fine spatial control. You can actually limit within this field to things that are sub-millimeter in size for being able to control the cavitation activity. This is what was termed microtripsy. So now let's talk briefly about boiling, right? So this is the flip side of being able to do it. So if I take millisecond length pulses, I can generate the boiling histotripsy analogous to the cloud histotripsy that's generated with short pulses. And the effect that you get is very similar in these two processes. And so this portion right here that's been treated is actually liquid, and you can wash it out. If you cut the tissue open, you can irrigate it and it'll just flow out. All right? So we've truly emulsified this tissue. So it looks something like this. You get this boiling event. This is using only 7 milliseconds to produce 80 degrees C. And the reason is this amplitude factor here, which is the shock amplitude. This change in temperature goes as the cube of that shock amplitude. So you really get an acceleration as you approach the focus, because that's where it's going to shock up And so you basically take all the energy, you dump it all at once. And then the temperature rises in that location. Now it's a very localized temperature. And the pulse repetition rate is actually very low. You're only pulsing about once a second, and the pulse is only 10 milliseconds long. So the time average power that you're putting in there is actually pretty low. So this isn't a global temperature increase like you would get with HIFU. It's a very focal event that then generates this boiling. In addition to that, obviously, this is a really low negative pressure. And you know that you could probably boil even without reaching all the way to ADC, because you know you have it under tension, right? Again, our colleagues from Russia, from Moscow State, started looking at this problem and they thought, well, this looks very similar to atomization that you get from an acoustic fountain effect. So for the engineers in the room, I have an exercise for you, depending on whether or not you've got this at home. But if you have an ultrasonic humidifier or access to an ultrasonic humidifier, take the top off of it. You're an engineer, you put it back together again, right? Who cares if you took it apart? And so what you're going to see is there's a transducer that sits at the bottom of this and a squirt of water that goes over that surface, right? And then what it does is it actually causes this acoustic fountain effect, and that acoustic fountain effect then atomizes the water vapor into the air, and then there's a fan that blows it off. And that's what gives you the humidity in the air. The guys, our Russian colleagues think that it even is more important that out on these little arms like this, that there's actually a little bit of cavitation that's actually occurring all the way out on those little arms. It's giving you an additional emulsification process that's giving you the atomization out there. All right? So their theory is you form this boiling bubble, this vapor cavity, and then subsequent shock waves that are coming through here are basically blasting through the tissue and blowing it into the boiling hole that you've left behind. So what they did was they said, well, what if we took a piece of liver and we actually sent an ultrasound pulse through here, like you use for boiling histotripsy, and does it atomize? Well, it certainly messes it up, right? It certainly is destroying tissue and blasting it up into this liquid half space that's sitting up, or into the air that's sitting up in this location. So you're getting this effect, this fountain effect, certainly from ultrasound fields that are of the type that you would use for boiling histotripsy. Now, I was just down at the University College of London, and researchers down there believe that this is not the mechanism for making this work. They have some evidence that indicates that that first boiling bubble has the same effect that the first bubble that we get from shockwave histotripsy does, where it forms that gas bubble, and now you have the impedance boundary, and from that point forward, it's a shock scattering problem. So, don't know. This is the discussion that's being had right now as to what the actual mechanism is. So, to kind of wrap things up, just want to give you a few kind of application ideas that are being investigated, and specifically by Zhenzhu in the biomedical engineering department. One and colleagues as well within biomedical engineering. Obviously, again, it's a team effort. So the application here is in brain. And so the reason that brain is important is because right now we know that we can treat, for instance, a central tremor with HIFU in the brain. Why did they pick a central tremor? Such an interesting problem to work on. But it turns out that a central tremor, the nidus for the problem, sits right in the very center of the brain, which is the ideal place to form a HIFU lesion, because that puts you as far away in producing that lesion from the skull as you can be. And so it's kind of the perfect target for sending ultrasound through an intact skull without heating the skull. So we wondered whether or not you could use histotripsy to do work in the brain, because histotripsy fundamentally will not have the heating problem. The time average power is very much lower. So you should be able to do treatment in the brain if you can get through the skull and be able to actually have the endpoint effect that you want without the skull heating. And so they're now looking at blood clots that are produced in the brain, and they're actually homogenizing these blood clots that would then be resorbed or extracted, liquefied and then extracted. And so they're able to treat within the brain for these blood clots, and you can actually see the treated portion on MRI. And the nice thing is that when you look at the effect that you can have, this is a phantom material behind a normal skull cap, you can actually produce the histotripsy effect within a very small margin of the skull. And if you put thermistors in here, thermocouples in here to look at the temperature, you get very little temperature rise even though you're producing this histotripsy effect near the skull surface. So it looks very promising in terms of being able to move into a regime where we would be able to look in different parts of the brain for being able to do therapies. So we can produce individual lesions, we can produce grids of single lesions, we can make the block M again, right? And this is all within the pig brain model that we're using. Okay. Then we've transitioned this, we've built an array then that's MR compatible, and we'll be moving that then into actual measurements of putting lesions into the brain under MR guidance. The other one is liver cancer, so we're looking at liver metastases. Liver metastases are a tough nut to crack. People who have a limited number of lesions in a single lobe that are of an appropriate size, you can do surgical resection to take that one lobe out. But once these metastases form in several different locations within the liver, your options for therapy are much more limited. The really interesting thing that we've observed in this particular circumstance is the effect of the histotripsy on actually stimulating the immune response. This is similar to cryoablation, which we know also has that effect, because the difference is with cryoablation, where you're freezing and then thawing the tissue, you break the cells. But what you don't do is expose them to heat such that you disrupt or change the antigens that are present within the tumor tissue. So what we did was, since histotripsy is a mechanical effect, let's treat one lesion on one side and look at not only the T-cell infiltration in the lesion that we treated, partially treated, but look at the contralateral. And what we see is almost the same level of activation in the contralateral tumor. That has two important consequences. One is, if we stimulate the immune response, we can then treat the local tumor, and if we leave anything behind, the body knows it's there. So now you can get down to what the cancer biologists call log kill, because if you leave just a small amount behind, then you have a pretty good chance of a recurrence. The other thing is that now the body knows that these are the kinds of tumors that exist. And so then they can go looking for that type of cell. And they don't know about that cell because it's being hidden before. The other thing that people have worried about has been, well, if you emulsify this tissue, then won't you just release cancer cells out to everywhere? Well, it turns out that even if you do release cancer cells, they don't necessarily form metastases out. The second thing is that if you have this immune response, then you might actually reduce the amount of metastasis that you would produce. So in this particular model looking at pulmonary metastasis, The control animals actually generate quite a few metastases, but if you treat the primary with histotripsy, then you actually reduce the number of metastases you see in the lung. So instead of increasing the number of metastases, you're actually reducing the number of metastases. So this is in an initial human trial. This is only a safety trial at this point in time. It's being done in Spain. There are a set of patients that have different types of primary tumors. We're treating the liver metastases associated with those tumors. And so these tumors then we're treating, then we look at secondary endpoints. It's called secondary because of the safety endpoints. But these secondary endpoints actually look very promising. So we have a 90% tumor regression. We have a very small amount of response from the patient in terms of AST and ALT elevation, but that gets resolved within a week. It's pretty pain-free. We have no problems with the pain associated with it. And we're actually getting some of the biomarker response that we saw in the animal studies. So now, to kind of tie everything together, if you want to use droplets in conjunction with histotripsy, the possibility does exist. So if you use nanoscale, say, droplets that would then extravasate out of the tumor tissue through the leaky vasculature, then you can actually apply the histotripsy pulses but use a lower amplitude and be able to trigger the histotripsy to occur. So these are bubbles that have been generated in material that contains these nanodroplets. This material also contains the nanodroplets. This region in here does not have the nanodroplets. But this is the focal region, which actually this is the highest amplitude. So now you have an additional way of spatially controlling where you would actually trigger the histotripsy to occur. So in summary, we've got various studies and a variety of ways of being able to use microbubbles for ultrasound-mediated therapy. The acoustic droplet vaporization, including nanodroplets, can serve as sources of gas bubbles for such types of therapies. And again, a wide variety of these therapies where histotripsy can be a means of actually disrupting the tissue for therapeutic effects. So thanks for your attention. I'm certainly willing to take any questions. Thank you.